who's already on here waiting too long. So that being said, hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining tonight's Fueling Fathers webinar, which is managing frustrations as a parent. So my name is Tanis Moore, and I am one of the registered provisional psychologists providing services here in CCMF Alberta. And I am also a parent. So I know all about managing frustrations as a parent from both the psychologist side and the parent side. So we thought that this would make for a fun webinar for everybody to have here in the thick of winter. So we can, we've lost our screen share. Looks like we're going to be managing frustrations with Zoom as well.
So sorry.
That's okay. All right. So we'll just get that started back up again and then we can get going. There we go. And if we can also just ask everybody to mute if you're not going to be jumping in, that would be awesome. Let's go ahead and make sure that everybody is muted here. Perfect. Okay, so if we can go to the next screen now, that would be awesome. Oh, I don't know if anybody sees the little squares on on the presentation, but there's kind of some squares covering up part of it there. Okay, yeah, so part of the screen is blocked. I don't know if we can move whatever those squares are. Oh no, it's popping up more screens. We'll just get it's always sunny and music playing in the background, and then we'll eventually get it. One more little square and then we're good. Almost got it. Okay, there we go. Are we able to move back to the previous slide, by the way? We kind of jumped ahead to there by accident. Okay, perfect. All right, there we go. So again, tonight's topic is all about how our children are all perfect angels 100% of the time and how we're nothing but blessed to be around them, right? Yeah, no, of course not. The title of the webinar is Managing Frustrations Towards Your Children, and I don't know a single person who isn't a parent who can't relate to that topic. Even the most picturesque Facebook family, I promise you, has had to bite their tongues probably several times a day at something their child has done. And I find this to be especially so in the winter months when, it's too cold to just boot them outside for a moment's peace when you're at the end of your rope. So this webinar is just basically going to be all about some strategies to manage that frustration in the healthiest way possible. So can we move to the next slide? Perfect. All right, as a bit of a preamble, in caring for children, there is an important concept called co-regulation. Essentially, children rely on you to be able to provide support to learn to manage their own feelings. If you let your frustration control the situation, tensions are heightened and things get out of hand quickly. However, if you can manage to maintain your sense of calm and provide a source of support and healthy attachment, this allows children to feel safe and gradually learn to self-regulate themselves as they get older. However, it's mighty tough to be able to provide them with this when we're experiencing so much frustration on such an ongoing basis. So what's a poor, frazzled parent to do? Next slide, please. I just want to start us off by reiterating something important that I encounter a lot when talking with other parents, especially fathers. We have all been there. So many people feel uniquely terrible when they experience a bad day with their kids and fly off the handle, raise their voice, or do something that they wish they oughtn't have done. However, children are pretty much literally built to test the limits and push us to within an inch of our sanity. It's how they learn about the world and how they work towards eventually establishing their own independence. This is, in many cases, a particularly vexing process, and unless you are the literal embodiment of Buddha, you're going to reach the end of your patience at times. Next slide, please. Nevertheless, as much as it is important to normalize this fact, we're all most likely here because we'd like to have a few more tools in our toolkit to help us better manage those times in the future. So let's get on to that now. In this presentation, I'm going to be offering a whole list of strategies for frustration management and then leaving some time at the end so that other folks can chime in with their own suggestions for people. But of course, I never shy away from participation during the presentation. So if you have something that you'd like to add in, please by all means feel free to raise your hand on Zoom or type in the chat box. And either I or my lovely co-presenter, Sarah, will notice that and we can interrupt the presentation to just slide that in there. No problem. We're open books up in here, so feel free. All right, next slide. Okay, so the first thing to do is to take note of your major anger triggers. This isn't always easy to do in a calm moment. So maybe try to think back to some of the times when you can remember getting really, really upset with your children. So what were they doing at the time? It's obvious to think of things like, destroying an expensive piece of furniture or throwing food at your head, but often there are things less extreme that just get our hackles up more than other things. So this might look like your child whining that they don't like the meal that you served after spending hours planning and making it. It might look like your child mouthing off when you try to give them basic instructions. It might look like your child purposely taking as long as humanly possible getting ready for bed. Whatever it is, try and make a note of trigger situations for yourself so that you can be on the lookout for these moments in the future. If we have no sense of what it is that sets us off, it'll be harder to control when those times arise. Next slide, please. On a similar note, it can be helpful to do a little self-work to look into some of the past origins of any of our own problem behaviors. For example, if we have a history of being quick to anger, it could be helpful to look into some of the reasons why this may be and try to work on alternative methods of problem solving. Another possibility is that we may have had our own problems with our parental figures growing up that may be manifesting in some of the ways we manage our own relationships with our children. Either way, being mindful of these kinds of things can, again, help us to be aware of areas where problems are more likely to happen so that we can be aware of them. These may also be things to seek help about in therapy to get to the deeper roots of these problems. Now, on the other hand, you don't want to go too far in the other direction and put too much pressure on yourself to fully overcome all of your weaknesses and become a perfect Zen master paragon of a parent. It's a nice thought to be able to get to a place where you never ever lose patience with your children, but it's not realistic at all. Holding these kinds of expectations for yourself not only increases stress on your end when you fail to live up to those standards, but you may also wind up developing unrealistic expectations for your children as well, which will only compound the problem further. Next slide, please. Now, let's talk about some more situational strategies. Your child is pitching a fit because you had the audacity to make chicken for dinner rather than the scrambled eggs they wanted, and they've just thrown their plate on the ground and are demanding, with all the force a preschooler can muster, that you make them a new meal. Time for a timeout. And I'm actually not meaning for the child. No, in a situation where things are getting heated and tempers are quickly flaring from both ends, it's actually a great idea for you to step away from the situation and give yourself a moment to mentally regroup and to take a deep breath before reacting with the often immediate and intense anger that you may otherwise experience when faced with a triggering situation. Assuming the child is not continuing on with some immediately destructive rampage that is resulting in the risk of harm to themselves or to the walls or your furniture, you can tell them, I'm going to step away for a moment and we can talk about this afterwards. Or if you're feeling too heated even to say that, just disappear in the bathroom for a moment. Take a few deep breaths while counting to 5, or splash some water on your face and arms. Just do something that involves some kind of deliberate action. Even though we may like to think that we are great at multitasking, our brains are actually surprisingly terrible at it. Doing some kind of specific action is like a small but measurable reset button that takes our concentration away from the immediate fight or flight sympathetic nervous system response that we get in the face of conflict. This is exactly what we want. As much as possible, we want to move back into controlled space, because that fight or flight space is where delightful responses like telling a toddler to F off live. Next slide, please. Instead, taking that moment to regroup can accomplish several things. First, the very act of leaving the room lets the child know that they messed up, and depending on their age and maturity level, they may respond in different ways, but that's another topic. Also, it prevents you from lashing out in an uncontrolled way. It helps put you in a more measured brain space. It gives you time to think about an appropriate response, ideally with problem solving rather than just punishment in mind. And we'll get to more specifics about that a little bit down the line. And just as a bonus, remember, absolutely no one is harmed if you flip the bird at the closed door. Everybody's got to do it sometimes. There are some other things to try that may be helpful as well, whether you leave the room in a situation or not. One is the use of self-talk or mantras. It can seem a little awkward at first, getting used to something like this, but when you're in the thick of a challenging parenting moment, or, just living the aftermath of such moments, especially when they don't end in a way you feel proud of, it can be easy to be filled with thoughts of, I'm a bad parent, or, oh God, I just suck at this, or I am definitely screwing up my child. If you can make positive self-talk part of your regular habits, you can effectively challenge this kind of thinking via brute force with messages like, I am trying my best. I love my child more than anything. My child is not being a butthole just to spite me. Or even simple statements like, I am in control. I am a rock on the mountain, to attempt to bring yourself back to a calmer state. Next slide, please. Another calming exercise you can try in the moment is something called calm place meditation. This is a technique I usually recommend for a variety of mental health concerns, but it can be particularly helpful here. What this looks like is simply taking a moment to try and envision a place you find particularly calming, like the beach or the mountains, and just try to engage all of your senses as much as possible to envision that place. So say you're at the beach, you might envision the feeling of the warm sand between your toes, the smell of the salty sea air, the sound of the waves, the colors of the sunset. And as you do this, you can sort of mentally transport yourself to a place of calm, even for just a moment, which can, again, be very helpful for breaking those moments of tension. Ideally, this is most effective when you have more than a few minutes, such as, if you have a partner or family members around to provide backup with the children. But it's possible even when you're on your own and need to take that aforementioned trip to the bathroom for that timeout. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so on that note, a solid strategy in trying to manage your frustrations with your children is indeed to get help from others, whether that be family, friends, babysitters, or even a daycare in certain situations, to be able to take time off for yourself every once in a while. It is hard to be on 100% of the time when caring for children. And there's a reason that we have that old phrase, it takes a village. I know it can be tricky depending on your situation, but it could take some creativity in the event that you don't have family or friends available. This may look like asking a neighbor, joining a social media group of parents in the area to try to get help or advice, or looking into babysitting postings in the area. Alternatively, here with CCMF, we have lots of support programs for men and that could be very helpful in providing a community to be able to help share frustrations, help share tips, or basically just being able to help share any number of experiences that you might be having. And that normalization process is, I find, one of the most important things towards helping people feel better about their situations. And honestly, even just talking to other people, so parents especially, about some of the frustrations you're going through may yield suggestions or may just be cathartic in itself. Just a reminder that sometimes there are some times where it is entirely justifiable to just let good old Walt Disney be a babysitter for an hour and a half so you can get a little downtime to soothe your nerves. Okay, next slide, please. I'm noticing also that there's still that little bar at the end that is just blocking some stuff off. So I don't know if that's something that can be.
I've been doing some research and I think it's something to do with my graphics card.
Oh,
So
no.
yeah, there's not much I can do about that right now.
Ah, darn. Okay, well, it's okay.
Yeah.
I believe the slides will be available in the event that we can't get that one out. At least it's mostly not blocked. So that's
Okay, sorry about that.
okay. All right. Okay, so now we can move on to some suggestions that don't involve just running and hiding from your children. Unfortunately, children often do not absorb the lessons that we try to teach them right away. After all, they may not immediately understand, or they may think that they know better, or they may just really, 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 really not wanna. Most of the time, there's really nothing that you're doing wrong to cause your child to not listen to you. There's just a tremendous number of different reasons they may not want to. Regardless, it's up to you to hold the boundary and to set the limits they need to follow. You can try and explain the reasoning to them, and depending on their age, they may be able to take in some of that reasoning. But the most important thing is just repetition, repetition, repetition. When dealing with frustrating behaviors in kids, you may feel tempted to respond with punishments for bad behaviors. And sometimes this is entirely reasonable based on the severity of the behavior. But I would encourage you not to rely too much on punishment and instead to try to reinforce positive behaviors. The reason for this is that punishment is not really all that effective in shaping behaviors. It's more reinforcing to the punisher than anything else, because it effectively allows you to feel like you're getting back at your kid for engaging in poor behavior. But let me remind you that the goal here is not to get back at your children, no matter how much it may feel like they deserve it. It's to provide them with effective discipline and guide them towards better behaviors. However, in the quest to get them to conduct themselves in an appropriate manner, you may feel tempted to provide some kind of external reward, like a toy or a candy, when the stars align and they actually engage in a behavior you want to see from them. I encourage you to rethink this strategy. Sure, it's not the end of the world every once in a while if you give them a reward for good behavior, but if it gets to a point where you're saying, directly or indirectly. If you do behavior X, then I'll give you treat Y. You're actually devaluing the intrinsic rewards for engaging in that behavior. So instead of thinking, I have to do my chores because it's good to help out around the house, or I have to do well in school because hard work is an important trait, you get, I have to do chores or do well in school because that's how I get things from mom and dad. By choosing instead to highlight the intrinsic rewards and respond simply with positive attention, this is a far more effective way to get them to want to do things for the right reasons. Furthermore, a lot of bad behaviors, especially in very small children, tends to come out because they are trying to seek attention and connection with their parents in some way. So providing extra positive attention for good behaviors tends to be especially reinforcing. Another scenario you may encounter is when your children are acting out because they are experiencing their own frustrations, perhaps over something they don't understand, or because something is not working correctly, or they can't figure something out. You may feel tempted to just step in and do everything for them, just to make them quit their incessant whining already. And I fully understand the desire to do that sometimes. However, as much as you may be tempted to do that, you should try to remember the difference between helping the child and solving all of their problems for them. While the latter may be easier in the moment, it's not going to help them develop any sort of independence and establish any sort of self-confidence or know-how. Instead, these can be good moments to try to bond with your children by acknowledging their frustration and offering affection. A personal tip I've found useful in approaching moments like these is to ask your child if they want to learn a secret trick to help them with whatever they're doing. This allows them to feel less like you're treating them like a little kid and more like you're letting them in on something. All right, just making sure that somebody wasn't wanting to jump in with their own comments there. Okay, might have just been somebody not muted. That's okay. All right, next slide. All this being said, one significant thing is to understand that as much as we love and appreciate our children, it is a universal, immutable truth that children are sometimes just assholes, and that in most cases, you absolutely should not take that personally. Unfortunately, the human brain takes an obnoxiously long time to fully mature. And while this is happening, children are going through all kinds of perplexing things, like learning the way their bodies work, the way the world works, the household rules, and why those rules go out the window at grandma's house. And of course, that lovely little trip through puberty. At all these different points throughout life, there will be many times where they quite sincerely believe that you understand absolutely nothing about their situation or about life in general. And it won't be until they reach adulthood when they realize that they too understand surprisingly little about life in general. All this to say that children are working with incomplete hardware for a very long time. So it's up to us as the adults to work with that. And knowing that, it can be helpful to remember that the focus should be on trying to maintain your sense of calm and to try and control your own behaviors rather than trying to control the child. If you get into a mode of trying to control the child, you're setting yourself up for a losing battle. After all, attempting to control the actions of another requires being able to reason with them. And in many situations where children are at their most frustrating, that's just not going to be possible. When you're working with such logic as, I'm going to throw a literal tantrum because I have a piece of broccoli in one hand and a cookie in the other, and I don't understand which one I want to eat first, you are not going to have any success bringing them to a place of rational adult thinking. And yes, I do have a picture of my own daughter in that very, very scenario, holding the piece of broccoli and holding a cookie in one hand. And she's just screaming her fool head off because she doesn't understand which one she wants to eat first. Do you think I'm going to be able to reason with that? No. It's much akin to trying to control the wind. Even if you manage to get one thing under control, you'll find 100 other things that are not in your control, probably in the very next 5 minutes. And then trying to do so will just get you more frustrated. But you are capable of controlling your own behaviors. So if you focus on that instead, the situation won't feel quite so out of hand. Next slide, please. Oh, excuse me, just one sec. Just a quick drink. All right, now, what happens when things do get out of hand and you have done something you wish you hadn't? Well, again, first, it's important to remember that we have all been there and that no one is a perfect parent 100% of the time. Second, this is actually a good opportunity not only to take time to repair with your children, but also to use it to illustrate that adults are capable of making mistakes too, and that they can try to learn from it. It's good modeling for children to learn, and it shows a level of respect for them when their parents acknowledge that they have done something wrong and want to fix it. Last but not least, I thought we could take some time here just to talk about a few ways to act to try to reduce the likelihood that frustration reaches an overwhelming point in the first place. First, it might be good to get into practicing gratitude or mindfulness. Take time every day, perhaps before bed at night, to think about something you really appreciated about the day or something that you are grateful for. Try to get into this mindset on a regular basis. So many times we get into the habit of thinking negatively about our lives, and this can really drag down our moods. Instead, practicing gratitude can be a powerful antidote to that and can help us to learn to recognize moments that we appreciate more readily than moments we dread. Those moments can help us to get through the periods of frustration more easily. Otherwise, forming a strong self-care routine and making sure that our cup is as full as possible, as often as possible, is going to be another way to make us more resistant to being overwhelmed by frustration. This might look like making sure that we get enough rest, or making sure that we set aside time for ourselves to do something purely for fun and enjoyment during the day. Maybe during nap time or after everyone else is in bed, or getting a babysitter to allow us time to do that. By taking care of ourselves, we will be better equipped to take care of tiny humans that often seem like they were designed to push us to the limits of our patience. So we can go ahead and go to the next slide, which is basically just the start of opening up the floor to audience participation and sharing amongst ourselves if anybody else has any tips for how they like to go ahead and deal with their own children if they've had any previous experiences themselves. Then we can go ahead and stop the recording at this point as well.